May 6th, 1943. The North Atlantic was a black, heaving graveyard. In the freezing surf, Oberleutnant Klaus Barsten clung to a splintered plank, the last fragment of what had once been U-521, a Type IXC U-boat that had stalked Allied convoys for months. His fingers were numb beyond pain. The sea had stripped away all warmth, all pride, all illusions of invincibility. Around him, the ocean groaned with the dying voices fading into the endless cold. 19 hours earlier, U-521 had been a hunter. Now it was the hunted, lying 800 feet below, torn apart by a destroyer escort's depth charges. Of the 52 crewmen who had scrambled topside, perhaps 20 still floated somewhere out there, ghosts waiting to drown. Klaus had served 4 years beneath the waves. He'd seen men vanish into the deep without a trace. But nothing prepared him for the silence that follows when a submarine dies, when steel screams, and then the sea swallows everything. He had been told what happened to German submariners who surfaced alive. The propaganda was clear. The Americans do not take prisoners in the Atlantic. That was the whispered gospel in Lorient and Kiel, that Allied destroyers, machine gun survivors, left them to freeze. U-boat command had repeated the warning as doctrine. If captured, expect nothing. Mercy is a luxury of fools. Klaus had believed it. Every submariner had. They'd been shown photos, supposed evidence of Americans shooting men in the water. Whether those photos were genuine or staged, they didn't matter. The idea was enough. In this ocean, mercy didn't exist. Klaus himself had seen what his own Navy sometimes did to shipwrecked survivors, orders that left no room for conscience. After 4 years of unrestricted warfare, the U-boat service had become a moral abyss where victory and annihilation blurred. So when Klaus heard the distant hum of engines that night, the unmistakable rhythm of a destroyer's screws, his first instinct wasn't hope. It was terror. They're coming back to finish us. A voice beside him gasped in German, "Sie kommen zurück." They both froze, waiting for the inevitable. Somewhere within him, the memory of his mother's Lutheran prayers flickered words of forgiveness, redemption, but they felt meaningless here. Klaus whispered a broken thought into the wind. God, forgive me for the ships I've sunk. He didn't expect an answer. The sound grew louder, then a blinding flare of white. A searchlight sweeping across the oil-slicked waves, slicing through the darkness like judgment itself. Klaus squinted, blinking through the salt in fear. The destroyer's silhouette emerged colossal, unstoppable, the USS Borie. He braced for the crack of gunfire, but instead came something impossible. "Grab the lines, we're throwing lines," shouted in English. Urgent, not cruel. Thick ropes and cargo nets splashed into the freezing sea around them. For a moment, Klaus thought it was a trick that the Americans wanted them to climb aboard so they could execute them on deck instead of wasting bullets. Then he saw a young American sailor descending the net into the water, risking his life to reach them. The sailor shouted again, voice nearly drowned by the wind, securing a life ring around an unconscious machinist named Friedrich. "Haul him up," he yelled, and the men above obeyed. The German vanished upward, swallowed by the light. Then the sailor turned to Klaus. "You can climb?" Klaus hesitated, half expecting mockery. But the American's eyes weren't hateful. They were furious, yes, but not at him. Furious at the cold, at the senselessness of it all. Klaus nodded weakly. "Then climb before you freeze to death." His hands were raw, the rope biting into the bone. Twice he slipped, once nearly falling back into the sea. Strong hands grabbed him from above, American hands, and dragged him onto the deck. He collapsed, trembling uncontrollably. Waiting for the boots? the rifle butts, the end. Instead, a wool blanket fell across his shoulders, thick, warm, smelling of diesel and tobacco. "Get in below," someone ordered. "Doc's waiting." Klaus looked up, expecting to see contempt. Instead, he saw focus, concern. No one pointed a weapon at him. One sailor sliced away his soaked jacket. Another wrapped his feet in dry rags. A third pressed a tin mug into his hands. "Easy, buddy. You're okay now." Klaus blinked, stunned. The words made no sense. He was the enemy. He had tried to sink their ships to kill them. And yet, here they were, treating him like a man, not a monster. As they carried him below deck, Klaus caught one last glimpse of the nets still hanging over the side, more Germans being pulled from the water, more Americans climbing down to help. And on the bridge above, the destroyer's captain watched in silence Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins, a man who had just defied his orders. Convoy command had been clear. Do not stop for U-boat survivors. The risk was too great. Submarines hunted rescuers as easily as merchants.
You're safe.
But Hutchins had looked into the dark, seen human beings instead of enemies, and made his choice. He'd keyed the intercom and spoken 5 words that would later define his career and Klaus Barston's life. "We're going back for them." That moment, simple, defiant, profoundly human, would ripple far beyond the freezing waters of 1943. It was a decision that would echo through generations, shaping not only the lives it saved, but the moral architecture of the peace that followed. The wardroom of the USS Borie had been transformed into a battlefield clinic, the kind that smells of iodine, damp wool, and coffee gone bitter on a warmer. Klaus lay shivering on a bench while a Navy pharmacist made 20-something, steady hands, the Americans called him Doc, ran through a fast, practiced assessment.
Me too.
Hypothermia, exhaustion, saltwater aspiration. The words meant little to Klaus, but the intent was unmistakable. Not interrogation, not vengeance treatment.
I didn't think we would make it
Warm
through the night.
water,
Neither did we.
not hot, Doc instructed. Dry clothes, keep him talking if he drifts. Orders delivered with an urgency that cared whether the enemy lived. 2 benches over, young Mott worker Werner, barely 20, stared at toes, drained of color, blue-white beneath a crust of salt. Possible frostbite. "Mark him priority for medical transfer," Doc said without drama, like he'd said it 100 times for 100 sailors in 100 different seas. The phrase echoed in Klaus's head, priority. He had helped send ships down without a second thought. Now the men who should hate him were prioritizing his crewmates' feet. A sailor arrived with a bundle. Dungaree trousers, a heavy knit pullover, thick socks clearly used, clearly clean. Another cut away Klaus's soaked undershirt with a knife and apologized, as if the embarrassment were his. The knife's quick whispers through cloth, the rough wool dragged over numb shoulders, the sting of life returning small indignities wrapped in large mercies. A tin cup pressed into Klaus's hands, coffee. Scalding, acrid, perfect. He coughed, sputtered, and the sailor grinned. "Easy. You're safe." He said the last word slowly, making sure it landed. Safe. Over the next 6 hours, as Borie rejoined the convoy and set course for Newfoundland, the wardroom became something stranger and more powerful than a medical station. A temporary republic of decency. Food arrived, real food, not a punishment ration. White bread with butter that softened under warm fingers, canned beef, stew ladled into metal bowls, peaches so sweet that Friedrich wept when syrup touched his tongue.
What's changed?
Hunger speaks every language, and it told them the rules here were different.
You'll be
Petty
processed.
Officer James McKinley, Boston-born with a grandfather stubborn German, appointed himself translator. His grammar faltered, his empathy didn't. Woher sind Sie stuttered through an accent that managed to be both Irish and New England at once. Kiel, Klaus replied cautiously. McKinley produced a creased photo from his wallet wife, 2 children, a small kitchen table with a birthday cake. Haven't seen them in 14 months, he said. The realization arrived like a weight in Klaus's chest. Every merchantman he targeted had contained wallets like that. Spouses, children, birthdays. He swallowed. Es tut mir leid, he said in halting English. I'm sorry. McKinley held his gaze for a long beat, then nodded. Yeah, me too. Hell of a war. Seaman Rodriguez from Texas drifted in with a harmonica and filled the edges with melody. Nothing martial, just the kind of tune you hum when work is done and the sun is low. A German machinist who had once played church organ in Bremen hummed along before daring a verse. No one stopped him. No one needed to know the words to understand the meaning. The wardroom oil-smudged, cramped, improvised, sounded briefly like a place where the war had already ended. Between breaths and sips, the conversation widened. An American engineering student turned sailor traded notepad diagrams with a German diesel mechanic, both of them sketching pistons and fuel rails, cursing cavitation with the same profanity. In another corner, an enlisted signalman tried to explain baseball with salt shakers and a spoon. 3 strikes, he said, but you always get another inning. Klaus wondered if the game was a metaphor or if everything Americans loved looked like a second chance. Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins appeared only once down in the wardroom, pausing in the doorway like a man unwilling to become the story. He moved along the benches, eyes measuring not cataloging enemies, but checking outcomes.
Hold on.
He spoke quietly with Doc, listened to the roll call of injuries, nodded once. When he looked up, his gaze cut a path through the room, calculating risk, counting blessings, and then he was gone. Minutes later, the ship's PA crackled. Well done. All stations maintain. No speech. No flourish. Just the business of keeping men alive. The miracle, if that's what it was, didn't rely on a single man's conscience. It ran deeper, like current beneath swell. The Americans seemed Klaus groped for the word trained to do this. Not merely ordered, but formed. He caught fragments he understood. Geneva, convention, same rations. Medical care is medical care. It struck him that policy was only as good as the people who carried it out. And these people carried it out as if it defined them. They followed rules not because they were watched, but because they wanted to be the kind of men who could live with themselves when no one was watching. Sometime before dawn, humiliation found him. Shock loosens control, cold breaks the body. Klaus discovered, with a flicker of dread, that he had fouled himself fear and failure wrapped in a stink that made him want to disappear. A Chinese-American sailor, seaman second class, Robert Chin noticed, said nothing to anyone else, and handled it with the quiet authority of someone who decided a long time ago that dignity was a right, not a reward. We need a basin, he called softly. To Klaus, in careful English, it's okay. Happens to everybody. He brought clean water, a towel, borrowed underwear. The shame ebbed. The lesson didn't. By sunrise, Borie rode the long gray swell toward Street Johns. The Americans cycled through watch rotations. The wardroom kept a pulse. McKinley returned with a final tutorial before the handoff ashore. Name, rank, serial number, that's all you say. He held Klaus's eyes, as if to reassure him he didn't have to perform gratitude to earn survival. You'll be processed, You'll
The
get a
aroma
camp.
of
It
aged
won't be the
tobacco,
Ritz, but
a
it'll be
silent
clean.
companion to
Food,
contemplation.
medical, some camps even have soccer. Klaus must have looked skeptical. McKinley chuckled. I got a cousin guarding one in Montana. Says the Germans eat better than he did growing up in Dorchester. Why? Klaus asked the question that had been burning holes in his thoughts for 2 days. We are enemies. Why? This? He gestured at the blankets, the coffee, the unwritten promise. McKinley's reply was a paraphrase of something older, stricter, and sturdier than slogans. Skipper said, "Someday, this war ends. I want to look in the mirror after." He let the words hang, then added, almost sheepish, "Besides, you treat prisoners right, and sometimes they stop fighting sooner. Makes the war shorter." My CO says that's strategy, not charity. Klaus filed the phrasing away, strategy that looks like mercy. He didn't yet know the architecture behind it, that commanders in Washington had codified the obligations, that Eisenhower drilled it into units across Europe, that Red Cross inspectors would sweep the camps with notebooks, or that mortality rates for POWs in American custody would remain below 1%, while other fronts degenerated into horror. He only knew what it felt like in the body, warmth returning to cold hands, coffee burning life back into a throat, a harmonica stitching a tiny seam across an abyss. When Borie moored at Street John's, the handover began clipboards, armbands, trucks with canvas flaps breathing diesel into the morning air. On the dock, a woman in a Red Cross uniform moved briskly among the prisoners. In careful German, she announced, "You may write one letter home, 1 page. It will be censored, but it will go."
The compassion shown to
The
prisoners
promise
of war
hit Klaus
foreshadowed
with the
aid that would
force of
help
a
rebuild
wave.
post-war Germany.
A page was a
policy of
continent.
reconciliation.
A sentence was a road back to the living. He bent over paper with a pencil that skated on his still stiff fingers and wrote to the only anchor that made sense. "Greta, I am alive. I am a prisoner, but I am unhurt and treated well. Do not worry for me. Tell Mother if you can. I will come home when this war ends." Simple words, nothing fancy, yet they felt like a bridge, rebuilt plank by plank. Before he climbed onto the truck that would take him inland, the last person Klaus expected to see stepped out from the line of officers, Hutchins himself. Through an interpreter, he delivered a message with the blunt precision of a watch officer calling bearings. "We did not rescue you because we like U-boats," he said. "We don't. You sank good ships, good men, but you were sailors in the water, and that's enough. When you go home, remember, we play by rules, even when it's hard." Then he did something more radical than any order he had given that night. He offered his hand. It hovered in the air, steady, unambiguous. Captains did not shake hands with enemy submariners, but the ocean had rewritten the etiquette. Klaus took it. The grip was firm, brief, and, unlike the sea, unchanging. Years later, Klaus would say that handshake weighed more than a medal. Not because it excused what he had done, but because it told him who he might still become. It said that there was a way to lose without being erased, a way to be beaten without being broken, a way to be the enemy and still be treated as human. The truck's tailgate slammed. Canvas snapped in the wind. As the convoy crawled up from the harbor into a town still wrapped in war, Klaus felt something he hadn't expected since the deck of U-521 heaved under the first pattern of charges. The smallest outline of a future tense. Not hope, not yet, but the place where hope would later live. The prison camp in Virginia was nothing like the nightmare the propaganda had promised. Klaus Barston expected cages, starvation, humiliation. Instead, he found routine, structure, even dignity. Camp Lee was organized with the precision of an industrial operation. Rows of barracks, a mess hall that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a library stocked with tattered German books donated by Lutheran churches, and guards who looked bored rather than brutal. It wasn't comfort, it was order, the kind that reminded men who they were. The food was simple, sometimes monotonous, but it was enough. Every prisoner received the same rations as American soldiers, Eisenhower's rule, written into the Geneva Convention directives, and the guards followed it like gospel. When Klaus asked one of them why, the corporal shrugged. "Because that's the deal," he said. "You fight by rules, you live by rules." Klaus learned that the Americans ran their war like an equation. Morality was not just idealism, it was strategy. Every German treated decently became a counterweight to Nazi propaganda. Every letter sent home was proof that the barbaric Allies were not what Goebbels claimed. Washington understood the long game. Today's prisoner could become tomorrow's partner in Reconstruction. 6 months into captivity, Klaus was part of a work detail assigned to an agricultural project. Under the Virginia sun, the soil turned black beneath the shovels, and the guards watched from under wide-brimmed hats. One afternoon, the supervising Corporal Miller from Iowa sat down in the shade and lit a cigarette. After a pause, he offered the pack. Klaus hesitated, then accepted. "Grow vegetables back home?" Miller asked. "No, I studied engineering, naval architecture." Miller laughed softly. "So you designed the boats that tried to sink us?" Klaus almost smiled. "That's true." They smoked in silence for a minute. Then Miller said something unexpected. "This war's gotta end sometime. When it does, what will you do?" "Go home, help rebuild. We destroyed so much." "Yeah," Miller exhaled smoke, looking toward the horizon. "My dad fought in the last war, France. Said the worst part wasn't fighting, it was coming home and realizing it didn't have to happen again." It was the most dangerous thought Klaus had ever heard. An American guard suggesting the futility of war. But there was no malice in it, only weariness, the kind of moral fatigue that comes from seeing too much waste. At night, in the barracks, the prisoners talked. Some argued politics, others traded rumors about Germany's defeat. But Klaus found himself thinking about the Americans not as enemies, but as men who seemed to believe in rules as a kind of faith. He began to realize something profound. The power of America wasn't just its factories or fleets, it was its consistency. A belief that even enemies were bound by a shared human code. The Red Cross inspections reinforced it. The Americans didn't hide their camps, they invited oversight. Inspectors walked through, checking food stores, medical facilities, even library access. They took notes, nodded, left satisfied. The German prisoners began to whisper among themselves. If this is defeat, what does victory mean? Across the ocean, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. News filtered in through the guards, fragments of truth about Soviet and Japanese camps, about starvation, torture, forced marches. In the American camp, by comparison, mortality rates hovered under 1%. In the East, tens of thousands of captured Germans vanished into the cold. Klaus understood then that he had been lucky not just to survive the sea, but to have fallen into these hands. He began to work in the camp's engineering section, sketching repairs for broken generators and pumps. When an American officer noticed his skill, he allowed Klaus access to proper drafting tools. Soon, Klaus was designing irrigation layouts for nearby farms. It wasn't freedom, but it was purpose. One day, he overheard two guards talking as they repaired a truck. "You treat prisoners right," one said, "because someday your own might need the same." That pragmatic reciprocity struck Klaus harder than any sermon. This wasn't idealism, it was civilization built on mutual self-interest, formalized into law, and it worked. When the war finally ended, the announcement came through the camp loudspeakers. Germany had surrendered. Some prisoners cheered, others wept. Klaus just sat on his bunk, numb. The guard who'd handed out the news noticed and said quietly, "You'll go home soon. Make it mean something." Weeks later, transport orders came through. Before departure, each man was allowed to write one more letter. Klaus wrote again to Greta, "I am coming home. I do not know what I will find, but I have seen something in these men, something our world must learn if it is ever to heal." In January 1946, Klaus stepped onto German soil for the first time in years. Hamburg was a skeletal city of ruins and smoke. His sister met him at the train station, eyes hollow but alive. They embraced without words. Their parents were gone, his father killed in an air raid, his mother dead from hunger during the blockade. He took a job clearing rubble for ration cards. Then, with the Port Authority rebuilding the docks he had once tried to destroy, it was slow, backbreaking work, but it felt like penance. Every beam lifted, every bolt tightened was a quiet apology to the future. 3 years later, when the Marshall Plan began to funnel billions into Europe's recovery, Klaus understood it instinctively. The same logic that had guided his treatment as a POW now guided American diplomacy. Compassion as policy, mercy as leverage. They weren't rebuilding Germany out of sentimentality. They were buying peace the long kind. In 1949, Klaus did something almost unthinkable. He wrote to Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins, care of the U.S. Navy, not knowing if the man was even alive. His letter was simple. "You saved my life in May 1943. Though I was your enemy, I have tried to live in a way that honors the mercy you showed. Thank you for proving that humanity can survive war." 3 months later, a reply arrived from Rhode Island. Hutchins had left the Navy, now a civilian engineer. His response was warm, direct. "Mr. Barston, I am glad to hear you made it home safely. We do what we must. Then we try to build something better than what we tore down. That's all any of us can do." They exchanged letters for years. In 1961, Klaus saved enough money to visit the United States. He met Hutchins in person. Two old sailors sat at a kitchen table, drinking coffee, speaking haltingly through memory and translation. When Klaus finally asked the question that had haunted him, "Why did you come back for us?" Hutchins thought for a moment. "The measure of a man," he said slowly, "is what he does when nobody would blame him for doing less." That answer stayed with Klaus for the rest of his life. In the decades that followed, Klaus Barston became one of thousands of quiet witnesses to a moral revolution disguised as logistics. His story was not unique, but it was emblematic of how the United States chose to wage peace after it had already won the war. By 1950, Germany was a nation in ruins. Its cities split between the rubble of fascism and the scaffolding of democracy. Yet Klaus, now working for the Hamburg Port Authority, sensed a subtle current beneath the reconstruction effort, an invisible architecture built on the same principles he had encountered in captivity. The Americans were rebuilding with discipline, not vengeance. Every bridge, every school, every shipment of Marshall Plan grain was a brick in a moral argument that mercy, when institutionalized, becomes power. For Klaus, this was not abstract. He could trace the lineage of this new order to a single night in 1943, when a destroyer captain had decided that decency was worth disobedience. The same nation that had pulled half-frozen enemies from the Atlantic was now pulling nations out of ruin, not for charity, but for stability. The humanitarian and the strategic were no longer opposites, they were allies. And in that synthesis lay the secret of America's post-war dominance. When Klaus visited the United States in 1961, he was astonished not by its wealth, but by its contradictions. The paradox of a people capable of both Hiroshima and the Peace Corps, of both racial tension and transcendent generosity. But when he sat across from Charles Hutchins, now gray-haired and retired, he saw no contradiction at all, only continuity. "We just did what we were taught to do," Hutchins told him. "You help a man in the water. You build something better when you can." Klaus returned home transformed. He joined the German-American Friendship Society, helped arrange student exchanges, lectured at schools. His talks were simple, almost austere. "I learned democracy from my enemies," he would say, "not from books, but from their behavior." He never used the word forgiveness. It felt too small. What he spoke of was transformation, the way an act of humanity can outlast ideology, the way moral restraint can become cultural inheritance. By the 1972nd, Klaus was part of a quiet cohort of former POWs who had become advocates for Atlantic cooperation. They were not politicians or diplomats. They were men who had once expected death and received coffee instead. That small mercy had scaled up into geopolitics. The NATO alliance, the European Union, the very idea of the West, all rested, in part, on the memory that America had treated its defeated enemies as future partners rather than permanent threats. Historians later called it the moral dividend, the compounding interest of restraint. For every German who had gone home with stories like Klaus's, another myth of American barbarity had died. And those stories, whispered at family tables and church gatherings, became the soil from which reconciliation grew. But the lessons were fragile. As Klaus grew older, he watched the Vietnam War unfold on television, saw the images of burning villages, the debates over prisoners, torture, and truth.
Why?
It pained him. "They've forgotten," he told his daughter Christina. "The rules aren't meant for when it's easy." He recognized in those controversies the same moral fault lines that had nearly swallowed the world in 1939. The temptation to dehumanize the enemy in the name of expedience. He understood something many strategists did not, that moral authority is a finite resource. Lose it, and no amount of power can buy it back. America's influence in post-war Europe had come not from its armies alone, but from the belief that it represented something cleaner, something fair. It was that perception, not just economic aid, that turned former enemies into allies. Klaus feared that forgetting this truth would be America's real defeat. In his final years, he wrote a memoir modestly titled The Water and the Light. It wasn't a soldier's boast, but a meditation on choice. He described the moment on the USS Borie not as a miracle, but as a decision made by ordinary men under extraordinary pressure. "We were told the Americans were monsters," he wrote, "but they chose not to be, and in choosing, they proved that civilization is a verb, not a state." When Klaus died in 1998, his funeral was small family, a few friends, and one American visitor, Mark Hutchins, son of the man who had pulled him from the sea half a century earlier. Mark carried a photograph of the USS Borie's crew, annotated in his father's hand. "The day we remembered, we were human beings first, sailors second." That line later appeared on a plaque at the Maritime Museum in Hamburg, beside Klaus's letter to his sister from the POW camp. Tourists passed it without always reading the fine print. But for those who did, it was a quiet revelation, a reminder that history is not only written by victors, but by the victors who chose mercy when they could have chosen revenge. The story of Klaus Barston and Charles Hutchins is, in essence, a story of moral geometry. A single decision at sea, projecting forward through decades of peace. It demonstrates what strategists now call the long arc of ethical power, the understanding that legitimacy, once earned, can achieve what force alone never could. It was that arc that allowed post-war Europe to become not just reconstructed, but reconciled. Every war tests not just who is strongest, but who remains human. And every generation must decide whether the rules still apply when no one is watching. Hutchins's decision to go back for them was not a deviation from military logic, it was its highest form. Because in the long game of civilization, restraint is strategy, mercy is infrastructure, and dignity, extended to the defeated, is the only real victory that endures. 50 years after that night in the North Atlantic, Klaus Barston stood in front of a German television camera, frail, deliberate, his once sharp voice softened by time. The interviewer asked him the question that had followed him through decades of peace. What did you learn from the Americans? He paused for a long moment, eyes unfocused, as if watching the black Atlantic again. Then, with a voice steady but low, he said, I learned that civilization is measured by how you treat the people you could kill. It was more than sentiment, it was testimony. Klaus had lived long enough to see Germany rebuild, to see his former enemies become partners, to see Europe turn from battlefield to union. He had seen the old flags fall and new ones raised in cooperation rather than conquest. And beneath that transformation ran a current invisible to most, a moral inheritance born in moments like his rescue. He told the interviewer, when I was in the water, I believed everything I had been told, that the Americans were cruel, that they would let us drown. Instead, they pulled me out. They gave me coffee. They let me write to my sister. And that changed my life more than the war itself. The camera lingered on his weathered hands, the same hands that had clung to wreckage, that had signed letters of friendship across an ocean. I spent 4 years believing in propaganda, he said, but 19 hours in the water taught me the truth. What Klaus understood, perhaps better than many policymakers, was that history does not hinge only on treaties or armistices, but on private decisions made in dark hours. The United States had not simply won the Second World War, it had chosen how to win. The difference was profound. In the Atlantic and Europe, American treatment of POWs was consistent, almost bureaucratic in its decency. It wasn't the product of sentimentality, but of systemic discipline, an infrastructure of ethics. From General George Marshall's directives to Eisenhower's field orders to the Navy's code of conduct, the message was the same. The rules apply even here. To the Americans, this wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Every captured German who returned home, treated fairly, became a living rebuke to Nazi ideology. Every former enemy who remembered decency instead of cruelty became a stabilizing force in post-war Europe. And the ripple effects lasted generations, from the Marshall Plan to NATO, from democratic Germany to a united Europe. What Klaus experienced personally was the foundation of a geopolitical doctrine that restraint, discipline, and adherence to law are not luxuries of peace, but instruments of victory. By the 1,990 seconds, historians would describe it as the moral economy of power, a framework that turned ethical consistency into global influence. In that same interview, Klaus spoke of Captain Hutchins with an affection that bordered on reverence. He could have followed orders, Klaus said. No one would have blamed him. The sea would have swallowed us, and the war would have gone on. But he didn't. He turned around. The interviewer asked if Klaus had ever seen Hutchins again. He smiled faintly. Once, in 1961, we drank coffee, talked about work, families, weather. Not about the war. We didn't need to. The handshake said everything. Then he added a line that would later be quoted in history journals and naval ethics lectures alike. Rules do not survive wars. People do if they choose to keep them alive. The power of that moment transcends history. It speaks to every generation that finds itself standing at the edge between necessity and morality. The 20th century proved that the two can coexist if leaders are brave enough to remember that mercy, too, requires courage. When America faced new wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the lesson of Hutchins' decision lingered like a ghost. For every violation that stained the national conscience, there were also soldiers, medics, and officers who remembered. The measure of victory is not the body count, but the moral ground you still stand on when the killing stops. Klaus's story became a case study in military academies, an example of how individual acts of decency shape the strategic landscape. Cadets read about the USS Borie not as a tactical engagement, but as a moral precedent. Hutchins's 5 words, "We're going back for them," became shorthand for a kind of leadership that sees humanity not as an obstacle to duty, but as its essence. In Hamburg's Maritime Museum, there is a small glass case near the section on the Battle of the Atlantic. Inside lies Klaus's letter to his sister, yellowed and creased from handling. Next to it, a black and white photograph. 2 old men standing side by side in Rhode Island, smiling under a summer sky. The caption reads, "Former enemies, lifelong friends." Visitors pass it every day, often without realizing that the quiet artifact before them represents the architecture of an entire post-war order. But for those who linger, for those who imagine that night in 1943, the freezing water, the searchlight, the ropes thrown into the dark, the lesson crystallizes. Civilization is not a condition we inherit, it is a decision we repeat. Klaus Barston's life was a long echo of that decision. He built ships instead of sinking them. He taught young engineers that efficiency meant nothing without conscience. His children became advocates for humanitarian law, quoting their father's mantra, "Mercy is not weakness, it is the foundation of peace." And when he died, the son of the man who saved him flew across the Atlantic to pay his respects, not as a representative of a nation, but as proof that decency can travel farther than hate ever could. In a century defined by total war, Klaus Barston's survival offers a different kind of victory, one measured not in conquests or treaties, but in conscience. It reminds us that the truest strength of a nation and of a man lies not in how they destroy their enemies, but in how they choose to spare them. That was the legacy of Charles Hutchins, of the USS Borie, of every sailor who threw a rope into black water that night. And it remains the test of every generation since, whether we still have the courage to turn back even when nobody would blame us for sailing on.